award-winning author of numerous books, including Thomas Paine and the Founding of America. He's a frequent contributor to the Huffington Post, the Daily Beast. How many people know what the Daily Beast is? 3 people. Well, I'm going to say 4.
A lot of people out there know what the Daily Beast is.
I didn't know. I was afraid I better look it up, that maybe the SPCA would be after me or something. There's somebody from the Daily Beast. But it's really a very, very excellent news reporting service on a website. It was founded and formerly by former publisher Tina Brown. I knew her, former editor of Vanity Fair and The New Yorker, and a short-lived Talk magazine. So I've been looking at the Daily Beast lately, and I'm very impressed with it. A lot of newscasts. So you learned about woozies tonight, you learned about cufflinks, and you learned about the Daily Beast. So keep coming back, you'll continue to learn. Steve LeMazo and I met Harvey at the FDI Library, which we go to several times a year when they have these book festivals. And Harvey talked about his book that he's going to mention, lecture on tonight, Fight for the 4 Freedoms. And I have to say, without exaggeration, it was one of the best talks I have heard in many a year. And I'm sure that everyone here will agree when he's finished.
And if you don't,
we're very fortunate to have copies of Harvey's book for the bargain price of $20. And since we're a tax-exempt organization, we don't have to pay New Jersey the 7%. And we have enough books here. Please support the books that our authors sell, authors read about. That's what brings them here, so that they can publicize their books and talk to you folks. Harvey will be here after the lecture to not only answer questions, but to sign copies of any books that are purchased. I'd like to now ask Harvey to come up and
there are boxes in there. Little boxes. Maybe, do I need to hand these boxes? This is actually kind of a blast for me. I'm a Jersey boy, originally. I was born in Englewood, New Jersey. After a very brief toddler moment in Queens, we moved to what was then called East Patterson. It became Elmwood Park. And I went to school, elementary school, and I graduated high school from Paramus High School up north. My mom is still living in the Paramus area. She lives in Washington Township, which is in between Paramus and Westwood. So in fact, this is a hometown crowd, which by the way, is not a good thing. Because hometown crowds are the toughest events, okay? They're the toughest. Because if I have any intention of retiring back to New Jersey someday, I may have missed the boat by what I do here and now, okay? But I do remain, in heart, a Jersey boy, even though I am a die-hard Green Bay Packers fan now in Wisconsin. Before I deliver to my hometown audience, I want to first of all thank Steve and John for bringing me back to New Jersey. And my wife is with me tonight, and we've been able to visit our daughter in New York and my mom up in North Jersey, and then this is the sort of crowning moment of the weekend. And I'm here, as John mentioned, to speak about my book, The Fight for the 4 Freedoms, what made FDR and the greatest generation truly great. But I will tell you that I'm not giving you my book talk, okay? I'm not giving you my book talk. They heard me speak at the FDR Library, and they were very enthusiastic and said, would I like to come back to Jersey to visit my mom and give a talk tonight? And I said, I would love to, absolutely love to. And I said, would you like me to give the book talk? I was about to, offer them talks. I said, no, do what you did then at Hyde Park. So that's the talk that I'm going to offer you tonight, okay? And to be honest, it's the talk that I most like about Roosevelt and the Greatest Generation, okay? But let me then explain something to you also before I begin. And I'm scripted because I have a tendency as a professor, and maybe Jim knows about this kind of thing, where you go in with plans to do something in an evening and something else you just go off on a tangent. You can't do that when you're speaking to a hometown crowd. You can do that when you're speaking to students who don't know what you're doing anyhow. So the first thing I want to tell you about this talk is that indeed I first gave it not at Hyde Park, I gave it at the Four Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island for the commemoration or the marking of the 69th year of the 69th anniversary of FDR's passing this past spring. So it is decidedly given with a little more emotion, perhaps, than a standard academic book talk. I was one of the advisors to the park. If you should ever get to the park on Roosevelt Island, Steve and I were just talking about this, it has almost nothing there. It's a very, very basic, beautiful spot. The reason you should go, if you feel inclined to go, is that it has spectacular views of New York. It's rare to be able to look at New York from that side of the, from that side of the island, and it's just absolutely beautiful. And also, I think the bust is a very handsome one, and the quote of the Four Freedom on the wall that you'll see there is, I think, the perfect set of lines. And I will confess to you, I'll be immodest and tell you, those lines I helped choose. So when you're there, read those lines, please, if you go. The other thing I want to say, which is far more important than what I just said, is that I wrote the book, The Fight for the Four Freedoms, not simply as a historian. As my academic title implies, Professor of Democracy and Justice Studies, my interests go beyond merely the historical, okay? And in this instance, I wrote the book as an advocate. I wrote the book as a historical advocate, and I will readily confess, call this a warning to those of you who listen to Rush Limbaugh, I wrote this as a political advocate. Okay? I did, and you're forewarned now. And in any case, there are those of us, in the academic community, there are those of us in the popular public community who think we make too much of the Greatest Generation, that we make too much of the Greatest Generation and its greatest leader. I actually think we make too little of that generation. I think we make much too little of that generation. I think we're failing to remember what, as my subtitle says, what truly made them great. And in failing to remember that, we fail ourselves terribly, as I hope you'll see from my talk. We need to remember. That's what my book is about, that's what my talk is about, that's what right now my life is about. Other than my wife and children, I do have a life, okay? But seriously speaking, I think we need to remember. I think we have to face up to the fact that for all of the talk of the Greatest Generation of the last 15, maybe 20 years, that talk, however valuable it was, in enabling us to remember and honor that generation, that it actually did that generation a terrible injustice. A terrible injustice, and I will begin to explain. When I started work on the Fight for the Four Freedoms, I had the good fortune of coming upon the Depression era and wartime writings of a columnist of the 30s and 40s, who goes on and continues to write through the 60s into the 70s. He began as a radical and a progressive, and after the war was very much a liberal. His name was Max Lerner. I not only liked what I read by Lerner, it often seemed as though he was saying exactly what I would have said if I had been alive at that time. I especially appreciated what he had to say about American history. And in a book he published on the very eve of World War II, a book he brilliantly titled, I love this title, "It is Later Than You Think, The Need for a Militant Democracy." And in this book, he wrote this line. I love this line. If any of you end up in correspondence with me on email, you'll see that I even put it on every one of my email messages. Here's the line. "The basic story in the American past, the only story ultimately worth the telling, is the story of the struggle between the creative and the frustrating elements in the democratic adventure." Let me say it one more time. "The basic story in the American past, the only story ultimately worth the telling, is the story of the struggle between the creative and the frustrating elements in the democratic adventure." I put that proposition not only on my email, on the top of every one of my syllabi for my students. Okay? I get obnoxious about it, you might say. And I think that if Franklin Roosevelt had read that line, and I have good reason to believe he did, that he must have relished those words too. For he continually advanced that very idea of American history in all of his speeches, not just his best, in all of his speeches. Now, Lerner stood to the political left of Roosevelt, but in critical ways, he always stood firmly with Roosevelt. And when I thought, as I had to prepare a talk last spring for the anniversary of Roosevelt's passing, and then I was going up to Hyde Park, I wanted to deliver it there, and I was overjoyed that John and Steve said, "Tell that story again, give that speech again." I think these words that I'm about to offer you are really, really meaningful and telling. So when I wanted to look at that event, FDR's passing, I went back to look at a column that Max Lerner wrote 1 year after FDR died. It's the first anniversary of FDR's death in 1946. And in that column, titled "FDR, the People Remember," Lerner wrote, and I quote, "A few days ago, when it had become clear that the whole nation would observe the first anniversary of FDR's death, the New York Daily News, the ever-conservative New York Daily News, published a griping editorial. Why, it asked, should Americans be observing both Roosevelt's birthday and his death day? Even for Washington and Lincoln, one observance day was enough. Why should this fellow rate 2? The answer, Lerner replied, is that the people remember in their own way. And recalling how Roosevelt had rallied Americans first to fight the Great Depression and then to fight fascism and Japanese imperialism, Lerner spoke of how they might well remember their president. Again, I quote Lerner. "They remember the collapse of an economy in 1929, the pathetic inaction of the men who boasted themselves the leaders of America, the Hoovervilles, the bread lines, the farmers' riots, the bonus march, and the Battle of Anacostia Flats, the blank and fearful despair of the world's greatest nation. They remember the crippled man to whom they turned for leadership. They remember his words, 'The only thing we have to fear is fear itself,' and the succession of crisis measures that came with the staccato authority of communiques from a battlefield. They remember the hope that began surging back into their hearts, the sense that whatever mistakes might be made, America had found its greatness again." And please keep that line in mind. America had found its greatness again. Lerner then spoke in equally moving terms of how Americans probably recalled FDR's wartime leadership. They remember the looming shadow of fascist power, the man who recognized the enemy for what it was, and sought against heartbreaking odds to educate a whole people out of their dream of peace and security to the awareness of danger. They remember the news of Pearl Harbor, the nation that overnight found itself knit together, the civilian who was their commander-in-chief, and picked the generals who held in their hands the destinies of all the young Americans. They remember the day when the Continental Wall was breached and we knew victory would be ours. And they remember the spring day when the news came that he no longer would be with them to lead their victories and shoulder part of their burdens. Now, I cite Lerner's columns not to validate Americans' many and diverse efforts at remembering both FDR's birth on January 30th or his death on April 12th, but rather to call our attention to the question it poses to us. To us who were not there in the 1930s and 1940s. To us who neither elected FDR to be president 4 times, nor served as soil soldiers in the CCC, GIs in the military, Rosie the Riveters in a war plant, or as volunteers with the Red Cross or the USO. To us, speaking of my generation, who have only heard the movies, read the books, watched the TV shows. The question is this: how and what do we remember of FDR? And for that matter, how and what do we remember of the men and women whom we have come to call the greatest generation? That is, the men and women who made FDR not only their greatest leader, but also one of our 3 greatest presidents. Oh, and by the way, my father served in the Bulge in a tank that looks sort of like that. Okay. Those of us who live in the long, long shadow of that president, of that generation, of all that they accomplished, how and what do we remember? It's a critical question. Very critical question. Political scientist, now passed away, Wilson Carey McWilliams, observed in 1984, a people's memory sets the measure of its political freedom. Now, clearly, we do not fail to remember. We have erected 2 magnificent Roosevelt memorials, one in Washington, D.C., the other on Roosevelt Island in New York. We have built a grand monument on the National Mall to those who fought World War II. And we have bought the books, seen the movies, and watched the documentaries. And yet, for all of the memorials, and the books, and the films, and the many public displays and gatherings, we are failing to remember the most significant thing. Arguably, the most democratic and inspiring thing. The very thing that now most of all, maybe most of all now, not since 1945 perhaps, if we needed to remember as much as we need to remember today. Now, when all that they fought for is under siege, and we too find ourselves confronting forces that threaten the nation and all that it stands for, we are failing to remember what made FDR and the greatest generation truly great. Yes, we remember that they rescued the United States from economic destruction in the Great Depression. Yeah, we remember that they defended it against fascism in the Second World War. You're already asking yourself, what the hell is he talking about? We remember that and that. What have we not remembered? We even remember that they went on to turn the nation into the strongest and most prosperous country on earth. However, at the cost of not only their memory and their legacy, but also our own shared prospects and possibilities, we are failing to remember that they did all of that against fierce anti-democratic opposition. And despite their own terrible faults and failings, they were no more saints than any generation. What they did is they made America freer, more equal, and more democratic than ever before in the course of doing all of that. As I'll note and explain. We are forgetting that they themselves came to see all the more clearly in the course of saving the nation from economic ruin and political oblivion, that the only way to truly defend, secure, and sustain American democratic life is to progressively enhance freedom, equality, and democracy. I'm going to say that again, because this is a point, as I tell my students, I don't care what else you remember about tonight or this afternoon in the class, keep this in mind. That president, that generation of Americans came to see For all of their faults and failings, they came to see all the more clearly that the only way to truly defend, secure, and sustain American democratic life is to progressively enhance it. They were the most progressive generation in American history. And I'm 60s generation, and I say that unreservedly. Franklin Roosevelt, who knew American history, who believed in America's historic purpose and promise, and who had extraordinary confidence in his fellow citizens, came to know that truth even before they elected him president. And he firmly believed that they knew it too. In fact, he had learned about it not just from his reading of US history, but also from his fellow Americans, especially with Eleanor's assistance from working people, men and women, rural and urban, both immigrant and native born. I just want to go on record, if any of you are interested, I reviewed, how many of you saw the Ken Burns Roosevelt series? I'm sure you all loved it. It wasn't very good. It wasn't very good, okay? And I'm happy to talk about that afterward if you'd like, okay? Anyhow, that knowledge that FDR had, that belief and that confidence, which gave FDR the strength and the courage in the face of the worst economic and social catastrophe in American history, to state in 1930, 2 years before he became president, he said, quote, "There is no question in my mind that it is time for the country to become fairly radical for a generation," 1930. To call in the 1932 presidential campaign for not only a New Deal, we all know the New Deal, he called in 1932 for a new economic declaration of rights. And to declare in 1935, I love this line, "Democracy is not a static thing. It is an everlasting march." And you know what? Roosevelt was right. He was not only right about US history, he was right about his fellow Americans. They did recognize it too, and they responded to his words with initiatives, with energy, with enthusiasm and determination. Together, president and people severely tested each other, made terrible mistakes and regrettable compromises, and suffered tragic defeats and disappointments. However, challenging each other to live up to their finest ideals and aspirations, they advanced them further than either had ever expected or likely imagined possible. Think about it. They not only rejected authoritarianism, you know, all across Europe and Asia, authoritarian rulers took power, held power, and ran their people into the ground. Not Americans. They also, Americans and that president, redeemed the nation's promise by initiating revolutionary changes in American government and public life, and radically extending freedom, equality, and democracy. Through a host of alphabet soup agencies and associations, you likely know these, I'm happy to translate. From the SEC, the CCC, the WPA, and the TVA, to the CIO, the AYC, and the NAACP, right? The AYC is American Youth Congress. Listen to what they did. Think about this. They subjected big business and banking to public account and regulation. They empowered government to address the needs of working people, and they established a social security system. They organized labor unions. They organized consumer campaigns. The most forgotten developments of the 30s are the consumer campaigns, by the way. And they organized civil rights groups. They fought for their rights, and they broadened and leveled the we in We the People. They built schools, they built hospitals, post offices, and parks. They expanded the public infrastructure with new roads, bridges, and dams. I love pointing to, in Northeast Wisconsin, I take my students through a kind of imaginary tour of Northeast Wisconsin. I point to the towns they know, and I call to their attention the post offices and the parks and the sewer systems, all a consequence of 1930s labors. Those same people planted trees, fought soil erosion, and improved the American landscape and environment. Not to mention, they cultivated the arts and refashioned popular culture. Just think swing music, if you will, okay? You know, and in doing all of that, they imbued themselves with fresh fresh democratic convictions, hopes, and aspirations. Eleanor herself said in one of her memoirs, if we hadn't done all of that, we could never have fought World War II. Never have fought World War II. And that's the argument that I would make as well. Now, all of that propelled the president, even as the Great Depression continued to haunt the nation, even as the armies of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were threatening to overrun the world east and west. All of that led him to not only profess, I do not look upon these United States as a finished product, we are still in the making, to not only declare, listen to this line of his, you know, this is phenomenal kind of speech writing. And he's known, yes, as having had a speech writing team, many a team, but his best lines were often his own. And he said this in 1936 at the dedication of a World War I war memorial in St. Louis. A true patriotism urges us to build an even more substantial America where the good things of life may be shared by more of us, where the social injustices will not be encouraged to flourish. He not only said that I do not look upon the U.S. as unfinished, he not only redefines patriotism, he proclaims the words we all know, this generation has a rendezvous with destiny. He not only does all of that, in 1941, January of 41, he takes America's grandest strivings, its grandest aspirations, and he articulates them anew into 4 fundamental freedoms. Now, every historian talks about the 4 freedoms as, you know, the global vision that America, the commitment that America is making to a global vision for a post-war world. Most people don't spend much time reading the lines that come just before the lines I'm going to soon read. Before he notes, mentions, promises the 4 freedoms, he lays out, and he says to Americans, we will not suspend, we will not give up or abandon what we've been doing. If we're going to fight, he doesn't say, if we're going to defend ourselves, because we haven't yet entered the war, if we're going to defend ourselves, we have to make ourselves healthier, stronger, and more prosperous. He actually calls, essentially, for national health care, among other things, at that point. And then he goes on and he says, in the future days which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon 4 essential human freedoms. It's very hard to quote Roosevelt because every historian listens to the speeches as well as reads them. And you can hear his voice. And your tendency is to try to emulate and mimic even what he says. Can't be done, okay? It can't be done, but bear with me. The first is freedom of speech and expression. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way. The third is freedom from want. The fourth is freedom from fear. Freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And by the way, conservatives still fear that. To go far out to the right, Ron Paul wrote a book a few years ago about freedom, spent an entire chapter belittling FDR's 4 freedoms. Jim DeMint, the senator from South Carolina, before he left the Senate to become the head of the Heritage Foundation, he wrote a book whose title I'm forgetting, but in it he actually belittles the concept of freedom from want, freedom from fear. So don't think they've forgotten how much they hate this stuff. The vision Roosevelt offered was global, but he rooted it firmly in American experience and aspiration. This is what followed those 4 freedoms. Since the beginning of our American history, we have been engaged in change, in a perpetual peaceful revolution. A revolution which goes on steadily, quietly, adjusting itself to changing conditions without the concentration camp or the quicklime in the ditch. The world order which we seek is the cooperation of free countries working together in a friendly, civilized society. And once again, Americans did not fail him. The name of the 4 freedoms, 16 million Americans were to put on uniforms and pursue a global struggle that we would come to call the good war. not for the character of the combat, but for the rightness of the cause and the unity of purpose in which the American people pursued it. With their allies, they would storm beaches, slog through jungles, tramp across icy fields, sail through submarine-infested waters, drive and deliver the goods of war against impossible odds, fly missions over heavily fortified territories, and punch, push, claw, and ultimately power their way to victory. Their fellow Americans back home would not only pray for their safe return, but also in their tens of millions go all out to provide the arms and material required for victory and to protect and improve what those young men were defending. Once again, president and people were to test each other. Made sorry mistakes, sad, regrettable compromises, serious defeats and disappointments were suffered. And in case you think I'm portraying them in one-dimensional way, yes, racism sorely marked the war effort. A racism that produced a Jim Crow segregated military. A racism that interned Japanese Americans. One of my dearest friends back in Green Bay, his father was born in one of the internment camps while his father was serving in the US Army in an intelligence role. It was a racism that instigated deadly urban riots, not to mention anti-Semitism, an anti-Semitism that denied America's historic role as an asylum for mankind. Nevertheless, believing in the nation's historic purpose and promise and refusing to be defined by that racism, that's the key. You know, we've all now come to understand the racism that marks American history and that marks that war effort. What we don't often remember is that those who suffered the racism and the anti-Semitism refused to be defined by it. And American people of every creed and every color would serve heroically in every phase of the war effort. Notably, while American Jews made up only 3% of the population, 550,000 joined the army, more than 4% of those in uniform. And Jews were hardly alone in that respect. Latino Americans and Native Americans were also overrepresented in the US Army, with 450,000 Latinos and 44,500 Indians serving respectively. And though they were limited by official quota, 1 million African Americans served, and even 22,500 Japanese Americans served, despite the fact that so many of their own families, the West Coast Japanese Americans, were interned in camps in the interior. And in all their diversity, Americans not only prevailed over their enemies, they once again compelled each other to enhance American democratic life in the process. Congressional conservatives and reactionaries, Southern segregationists, white supremacists, did their damnedest to deny the promise of the four freedoms. They even voted to try to deny GIs the right to vote overseas. Republicans were afraid that the GIs would all vote for FDR. Southern Democrats were afraid that black GIs would vote and actually like it. Okay? They had no intention of suffering the consequences. Well, the bill was watered down, but it passed eventually. And indeed, more than 60% of the GIs voted for FDR, and you can imagine who African Americans voted for. And believe me, they had no intention of turning back the clock when they came home. But despite that opposition, President and people expanded the labor movement again, expanded the consumer campaign movements again, and expanded the civil rights movements again. In 1941, there were 50,000 members of the NAACP. At the end of World War II, there were at least 450,000 members. That's the kind of multiplication that took place. Moreover, and this is the stuff this is the stuff that people really do forget. That generation looked forward to pursuing new liberal and social democratic initiatives at war's end. Listen to this. There were surveys done in 1943 and 1944 that Roosevelt commissioned by the National Opinion Research Council, which was headquartered then in Princeton. He wanted to know to what extent Americans wanted to not just renew the New Deal after the war, but actually drive it further in a progressive direction. So these were surveys done nationally. And this is what they showed. 83% of Americans wanted to expand Social Security to include national health care. 83%. And 1943 and 44. 90% favored joint planning by government, business, and labor to do away with unemployment after the war. And 73% supported not only new public works projects, they wanted a guarantee of, listen to this carefully, a guarantee of the right to work. That is, that the federal government would guarantee a job. Now, the term right to work has come to mean that you wouldn't have union shops, that a state could outlaw union shops, okay? Americans believed that right to work meant you had a right to a job. Well, needless to say, those who had no intention of going in that direction, grab hold of that term and they use it and turn it inside out. The point here is that about 85% of Americans, and this includes Republicans, wanted not only to revive the New Deal, they wanted to create a social democratic America. They didn't worry about people not wanting to work if they got gifts from the government, because they knew Americans were about working. Empowered by this knowledge, knowing what Americans wanted, Roosevelt, the same man who in 1932 called for a new economic declaration of rights, and in 1941 for the four freedoms, now went before Congress in January of 1944 and called not just for a GI Bill of Rights, but for a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights to make the four freedoms real. As he presented it, the second Bill of Rights would include the right to a job with a living wage. Roosevelt, by the way, said back in 1933, he said, no company should be allowed to exist in the United States that does not pay a living wage. He made that statement as he signed the first minimum wage executive order, okay? The second Bill of Rights would include the right of every family to a decent home, the right to health care, the right to security in old age, and the right to a good education. But it was not to happen. As much as the overwhelming majority of Americans wanted it, a right-wing congressional coalition of Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats opposed it. We almost didn't get the GI Bill of Rights, okay? Almost didn't get it. Many a Republican had serious reservations about it, and Southern Democrats had reservations about it because they didn't want blacks to get included. History is filled with ironies. Are any of you members of the American Legion? The American Legion is historically, ever since its founding around World War I, a very conservative organization. When they heard that conservatives in Congress might not go along with Roosevelt's call for a GI Bill of Rights, they mobilized all of the Legion posts across the country to lobby. Their lobbying and their own participation in this effort led to an even more generous bill than FDR ever imagined. So there you go, grassroots American activism. Even if it's conservative, if it works in a good way, embrace it. And indeed, 12 million Americans, men and women, white and black, took advantage of the GI Bill at war's end. Now think about this. 12 million veterans took advantage of the GI Bill. The population of the United States was over, but not terribly far over, 130 million. Roughly speaking, and I mean roughly speaking, that's 1 in every 10 Americans participated in some fashion in the benefits of the GI Bill. That's extraordinary. The nation was remade, a whole generation was remade, a whole generation came to believe that the American promise of the four freedoms was possible. Now, Roosevelt passed away in April 1945. We know Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan surrendered in the months that followed. But the promise of the four freedoms did not expire, even as the United States began to take off in an unprecedented economic expansion. You know, from 1946, 47 to 1974, the world experienced an economic boom that unprecedented in human history, which was led by the economic growth and development taking place in the United States, which actually was based on the initiatives of the New Deal, the campaigns of the war, the social democratic policies of the GI Bill, and a hell of a lot of energy that a generation of young Americans had accumulated while fighting fascism. At the same time, we enter into a Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. But that generation, for all of its faults and failings, we know about McCarthyism. We know how long it took from the end of the war to the time of the Civil Rights Act, 20 years. Nevertheless, they had not forgotten the promise of the four freedoms. Now, conservatives, again, reactionaries, and corporate leaders had their own ideas for the post-war period. They did not want to see labor unions continue with that kind of strength. They did not want to go through the consumer campaigns again. They had little desire to see the success of the civil rights movement. But for all of that, even with all of that, during those 20 years, from 45 to the mid-60s, if you look closely, there is continuous progress, continuous advance on the four freedoms. It's not fast, as fast as the generation might have imagined, but it happened. Picking up where they had left off in 1941, they built new communities, churches, schools, and civic associations. They launched the interstate highway system. They secured even ever higher living standards for their families. And when they were seriously challenged, and this is really a thing we really forget, my generation is much too chauvinistic. When my parents' generation was seriously challenged in the 1960s to live up to the promise of the four freedoms that they had struggled to articulate and to advance, they recommitted the nation to doing so. Think about this. Let me start off. Let's imagine the average veteran in 1945 might be 25, 26 years old. Okay? How old would they be in 20 years later? 45, okay? 45. They've just entered middle age. They've just entered, keep that in mind, okay? Those who marched for civil rights, campaigned to end poverty, organized public employee unions, pushed to enact health care for the elderly and poor, demanded equal rights for women, reformed the nation's immigration law, expanded public education and the arts, pressed for regulating business and industry to protect the environment, workers, and consumers, and protested the war in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, did not regularly recite those freedoms. But there were those who did. And they were not only inspired and informed by the struggles and achievements that the Four Freedoms generation, FDR and the greatest generation, first proclaimed and had fought for, they were called to act anew by military and civilian veterans of the fights of the 30s and 40s. I'll give you just a rough sampling. Kennedy and Johnson, and Nixon, World War II veterans. And in case you don't know, or don't remember, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission were all signed by Nixon, not by Johnson. Okay? Nixon actually, in those years, spent more money on the war on poverty than Johnson had. Okay? I'm not defending Nixon, ever. But he was part of that generation, and he knew that if he was going to be elected and sustain himself in office, he had to act like a member of that generation when it came to the social democratic questions. A. Philip Randolph, who had the vision of the March on Washington movement in 1941, is the one who called for the March on Washington movement in 1963. We all remember King giving the great speech about the dream. But Randolph, the black labor leader, is the one who put, with Bayard Rustin, who put the march together. Walter Reuther, the head of the UAW, young man in the 30s, fought the UAW's battles, fought the battles all the way through the war as well, sustained himself after the war as the head of the UAW, became the head of the CIO. Without Walter Reuther at the UAW, the civil rights movement would have collapsed, because the UAW helped to underwrite the civil rights movement. The March on Washington, to get to Washington, the buses provided to bring people to Washington were paid for by the UAW. Here's another thing. The SDS, which you may have different, your own feelings about, Students for a Democratic Society, okay, anti-war. Its first meeting was at a UAW headquarters and was sponsored with UAW dollars. Walter Reuther. And I could go on and on. The UAW helped to underwrite the major movements, including the feminist movement of the 1960s. Jerry Worth. Any of you members of AFSCME any time in your lives? No? Okay. Cesar Chavez. You all remember that name. Navy veteran, World War II. Ella Baker. Black woman organizer, 1930s, 1940s. She was the mentor to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She brought the sit-ins into and organized, after the spontaneous sit-ins, she organized with those young men and women the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. James Farmer of CORE. Betty Friedan. Anybody remember Betty Friedan? Okay, Betty Friedan regularly, I was on a committee once with Betty Friedan. I could not believe, she suppressed her own story. She was a radical labor journalist in the 1940s. She gets, later she becomes, the godmother of American feminism. Her beginnings are in the labor movement of the 1940s. Rachel Carson. Everybody knows Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. You know what she did for a living? She was in Roosevelt's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, 1930s, 1940s. Barry Commoner. Anybody like me vote for Commoner in 1980 on the Citizens Party? No, maybe not. Okay, led the anti-nuclear, he led the campaign to bring an end in the 60s to atmospheric testing, nuclear testing, okay? Jacob Javits. Anybody know Jacob Javits? Okay. Do you all know, Jacob Javits was one of the last of the liberal Republicans. That I'm sure you realize, okay? He was one of the organizers after World War II of the American Veterans Committee, the most progressive veterans organization coming out of World War II. It was headed by one of Roosevelt's sons, what's his name? Bill Malden. Okay, Bill Malden, the cartoonist, and Audie Murphy. Yeah. Okay, and this is the punchline one. One of the other leaders of spokespeople for this very progressive was Ronald Reagan, by the way. Yeah. Okay, but there were Republicans such as Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. Okay, in Massachusetts, Jacob Javits in New York State, and a Democrat who had being a Republican, became a Democrat in response to McCarthyism, Gaylord Nelson, the great environmentalist senator out of the state of Wisconsin. I mean, that generation, and I could just give you names upon names. Think about the changes, the initiatives, the legislation of the 1960s. My generation was born basically in the late 40s. I was born in 1949. I couldn't even vote in those years, okay? But supposedly I'm a 60s generation. It's that generation that makes the 60s the 60s. Maybe not the sex, drugs, and rock and roll stuff. But the stuff, well, as my parents said, do you think you invented sex? That kind of thing. But the fact was, the legislation is not the consequence of any of us marching in the streets alone. It has to do with a generation that voted people into office, that passed these things. If you ever want to read something, go online, and call up the 1960 Democratic Party platform. Remember, this is before the anti-war movement. Well, this is before the civil rights movement really takes off. This is before the women's movement takes off. I mean, look at that platform. It is progressive. It's predicting the 60s in a most remarkable way. It was authored by Chester Bowles, who had headed the Office of Price Administration during World War II. And by the way, he had to ask John Kennedy, could he live with it? Because Kennedy was not a liberal. I hate to disappoint all of you. He was not a liberal. If you think he was, then think again. Kennedy was a centrist and in some ways a conservative. You know, his family was very close to McCarthy. Kennedy stayed home sick rather than vote against to censure McCarthy. Kennedy used to tell people when they said, oh, he's a liberal, Kennedy would say, I'm not a liberal. I refuse to join the American Veterans Committee, which, by the way, Ronald Reagan, as I told you, had been a member of. In 1960, this see what I mean by a tangent? I'm going on. In 1960, it was Kennedy and Johnson, Nixon and Lodge, 4 veterans, right? The only one who had been a member of the American Veterans Committee was Lodge, right? It's the irony of history. Lodge's family was known for opposing, am I right? Opposing the entry into the League of Nations. Yeah. The American Veterans Committee championed the United Nations. Henry Cabot Lodge, gotta love this guy. Sorry, I'm going way off. Let me come back. Let me finish off my point about the 60s by telling you about Edward Wood Jr., World War II veteran and a writer. He wrote a letter to the editor of the New York Times sometime last year because the big debate underway in history circles that was overflowing into political circles has been, what is LBJ's legacy? How can a president who had the makings of greatness be scorned for so long? So it's the 50th anniversary of Civil Rights Act and so many of those initiatives. So the debate is, will Johnson's memory, you know, his story be resurrected and told anew? This is what Edward Wood Jr. wrote this to the New York Times. For my generation of World War II veterans, the social legislation passed under President Lyndon Johnson's leadership helped fulfill some of the ideals we had fought for in that war, expressed in 1941 by President Franklin Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. And then he says, I cried from a long-delayed joy when Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. Johnson's other legislation still resonates 50 years later. His initiatives helped create the society we fought for from 1941 to 1945. Undeniably, after more than 30 years of subordinating the public good to corporate priorities and public and private greed, these are my words now, after more than 30 years of subjecting ourselves to widening inequality and intensifying insecurities, after more than 30 years of denying our own democratic impulses and yearnings, and now especially when our democratic rights are under assault. How many states, I can't actually answer my own question, but how many states have sought to pass voter ID laws when there is no story of fraudulent voting in the United States worth reporting? Thank goodness we still have a chance in Wisconsin. The courts, you know, basically threw out the voter ID law, and the Republican Attorney General said, we won't try to get it back in before the elections. Okay. Texas, the court allowed them to go through with it. Okay, voting rights are the most fundamental rights of democracy, and there are initiatives to turn back the clock. So when I say our democratic rights are under assault, that's most especially what I have in mind. The age of Roosevelt and the greatest generation, with its progressive pursuit of the 4 freedoms, seems a very long time ago, I admit. But ask yourselves, do we not embrace the promise of the 4 freedoms? Do we not feel the democratic impulse that our parents and grandparents, maybe your older brothers and sisters, passed on to us? Do we not yearn to enable America, as Max Lerner put it, to find its greatness again? Of course we do. And yet we seem to have forgotten how to do it. We seem to have forgotten how to do it when it was our parents or grandparents who just did it. So we need to remember. We need to remember who we are. We need to remember that we are the children and the grandchildren of the men and women inspired by Franklin Roosevelt who not only rescued the United States from economic destruction in the Great Depression, who not only defended it against fascism and imperialism in the Second World War, and who not only turned it into the strongest and most prosperous country in human history, but also did all of that by harnessing the powers of democratic government and making America freer, more equal, and more democratic than ever before. But we need to do more than remember. And here I turn again to Max Lerner. In July 1948, just 2 years and a bit after he penned FDR, the people remember, Lerner wrote a column that he titled "The Waste of History." With the memory of the previous 15 years still powerfully fresh and impressive, but now worried about not just the right-wing political reaction we would come to call McCarthyism, but also the failure of liberals to deal with it, Lerner wrote, "The creative capacity itself seems to have gone out of American political life." He wasn't about to give up his own democratic hopes, for as he said, "What we did once we can resume," but he seriously lamented what he saw happening. The tragedy, he observed, lies in the waste of our experience, in the waiting while all the old blunders are committed over again. Now, happily, it would turn out that our parents were not about to waste their history. Sadly, however, it looks like we're doing just that. So we need not simply to remember. We need to do what FDR and our parents and our grandparents did to defend, to sustain, and secure American democratic life. We need to enhance it. Or as FDR put it back in 1930, we desperately, he didn't say it, I'm saying it. We desperately need to make America fairly radical for a generation, just like our parents and grandparents did. Thank you. Sorry about haranguing you, but every day that passes, I get more and more pissed off. Yes?
2 questions.
Yes.
Why did he let the ship to St. Louis stop in the United States? We weren't at war at the time, I know that. But there's a lot of talk. Why didn't he allow that to...
Well, the story of St. Louis is not nearly as bleak as we've come to believe. Okay, but let me back off. Okay, that is a great question. My mother asked me that question, and I don't have a powerful answer for you. I don't. But I will say this. Okay, there are those who are prepared to say that Roosevelt was an anti-Semite. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I'll explain what I mean. There is no moment in his life where anyone can ever cite, Steve may have some story I'm unaware of, but there is no what's the word? Proven case where Roosevelt spoke an anti-Semitic word. However, just for the record, at the same time, of the two, the one who did was Eleanor.
That's right.
As a child and young adult, she was an anti-Semite and a racist. By the way, this is one of the problems with the Burns film. He fails to explain, he never mentions that stuff, but even worse, this is supposedly an intimate history he's telling. What he fails then to explain is how she overcame it. And she overcame it because in the 1920s, she was working closely not just with the League of Women Voters. She was working closely with the Women's Trade Union League. And she became very good friends with Jewish women labor organizers in Lower Manhattan.
Esther Lake.
Sorry?
Esther Lake, Elizabeth Reed.
And Schneiderman, right. And basically her personal encounters with these people enabled her to overcome all of that. Franklin Roosevelt is unknown for that. Next thing. Franklin Roosevelt's the term didn't exist, but his chief of staff was Judge Samuel Roseman. He's Jewish, okay? He brought in his friend. Only second time in US history, a Jew is in the cabinet. Now, having said that as a preface, the State Department of the United States was as anti-Semitic as you can imagine. Undeniably so. In fact, I said to Steve before, when we were having dinner, I said, to my mind, Roosevelt's sin in those terms was not what he did during the war. Everyone said bomb this, bomb that. It's the fact that he didn't purge the State Department. He should have purged the State Department. Okay, okay. So that's the only answer I really have for you on that. Okay. Yes.
If the Depression hadn't occurred, would the radicalism that you propose and talk about have occurred?
No, it would not have. I actually believe that America, I've actually written about this, so I'm not doing this off the top of my head. I seriously believe that Americans are radicals at heart. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean they'll go in one direction or another necessarily. What it means is that at moments of crisis, it requires effective articulation of what Americans are about to enable them to if you like, overcome, to transcend the crisis. But along with that, the only way we have ever effectively transcended a crisis is to actually go radical. I'll give you, and let's take I'm now giving you my next book. Who are the three greatest presidents in American history?
Washington, Lincoln,
And FDR, okay? I was waiting for someone to say Reagan, but that's, okay. Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, right? Three greatest presidents, okay? Now, in fact, Washington's greatness actually stems as much from his leadership in the military pre-presidential as anything else. The point is, you say to students, so what makes him so great? And they say, well, it's the wars, you know, Revolution, Civil War. One of the original members of the Brains Trust was a guy named Rexford Tuglow. And he wrote a book many years later, 10 years after Roosevelt's death, titled The Democratic Roosevelt. And as I was telling Steve, there's this great line, or John, I was telling one of them, there's this great line that I really want to use in a speech. And I'm hoping to get it, hoping next year somebody will invite me to give the speech where I can use it. He says, "We are a lucky people. When we needed to create the nation, we found a Washington. When we needed to sustain a nation, we found a Lincoln. And when we needed to keep ourselves from falling to tyranny, we found Roosevelt." Well, neither Washington, Lincoln, nor FDR would ever have attributed it to luck. Okay? And as much as they had tremendous egos and were ambitious politicians, if you look closely at how they became great and how the United States creates itself, sustains itself, secures itself, it's because American citizens pushed them to greatness. They didn't just follow them, they pushed them to greatness. Thomas Paine and the artisans and farmers of 1775 and 76. Black slaves in the South were abandoning the plantations in the tens of thousands, and Lincoln came to recognize without the Emancipation Proclamation, they weren't going to win the war. And indeed, 200,000 African Americans served in the Northern Army, in the Army of the United States. And Roosevelt is hesitant to go with the promise he made to Francis Perkins about, he promised Francis Perkins he would pursue Social Security, and the National Labor Relations Act, which he had promised Sidney Hillman and others. And when he's a little anxious about things, they pushed him to do this, and over again. So I don't think, the absence of a Great Depression, Hoover would have been reelected. This is something I never hope to be quoted having said. If you think about history, as we all do, if you think about it, if there had not been the Great Depression, and there had not been a Roosevelt, and this mobilization of American energy, don't forget, that generation changed the we and we the people. Up until Roosevelt, by the way, up until Roosevelt, if you were not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you were not really an American. Okay? With Roosevelt, Catholics and Jews could stand as tall as any white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Okay? The New Deal, I love simplifying things quite often, but the New Deal was written by the vaudeville team of Cohen and Corcoran, or Corcoran and Cohen, this Irish American and this Jewish American. That's Roosevelt's era, and that's that generation. So think about it this way. If Republicans had won and won and won, Maybe Lindbergh would have been president, God forbid. No, look, seriously speaking, Republicans would have cut deals, without doubt. They voted against the draft, okay? They did not want to fund the defense effort. I mean, you really have to understand that the Republican Party would not have done anything that Roosevelt had done regarding building up the defense and enabling. I can say that because I have I can just show you the story. So that's my answer, okay? In a rather perverse and roundabout way.
Would we have lost the war?
Would we have lost the war? Oh, we would have. Without Roosevelt, I have no idea what would have happened. We would have cut a deal. We would have cut a deal.
Or would there have been a war because Hitler wouldn't have come to power?
If there hadn't been a depression. Oh, sorry, sorry. Indeed, I know what you're saying. Yes. No depression. You're right. No Hitler. I grant that.
If there was no depression, there would have been a Roosevelt. So therefore, there would have been a Hoover, and history would have continued on like
But you know what? You know what? I mean, I'd be the last person wishing for a depression or a war. But if that's what it took to make Jews and Catholics the equals of Protestants, then that's what my father fought for, and he probably would have had no regrets about it.
World War I under Wilson.
What's that?
Actually started under World War I with Wilson.
Yeah, don't go the Pat Buchanan route with me right now, because I won't buy that one at all.
During World War I, you should be.
I'm not going to go that route, because the transformation that occurs, that makes America occurs during the Roosevelt years. Okay, don't forget Woodrow Wilson segregated Washington D.C. Yeah.
Roosevelt basically lied to the country in 1940, 41 to get reelected.
And what was the lie?
That he would not bring the United States into the...
No, he said he would not. No, he didn't say that. He didn't say it. What he said is, he talked about he would, unless the United States were... I'm not saying that, by the way, let me back off. I know what you're saying and I agree with you. But to call it a lie, I think, is to exaggerate what actually took place.
Well, there's a famous video clip of him at a dinner announcing, "Our boys will not enter the war." When he moved back from the podium, it's reported Eleanor turned to him and said, "You're going to have to live with that lie," because they all knew what the story was.
Right.
My point is,
yeah, so I agree with you on that.
had the American people not bought that, and he was not reelected in 1940, his legacy would essentially have been a failure. The 8 years of
If he had not been elected,
reelected for the third term, and his history.
That's a good. In the what if categories, that's a really good question about the legacy. That's a really good question.
The first 8 years were essentially a failure.
No, I will definitely not buy that. Absolutely not. That's part of the mythology. Look, let me be very clear. That is absolutely wrong. That is absolutely wrong. The United States was transformed in the 1930s. Absolutely transformed. I just list sewers, parks, playgrounds, schools, hospitals, labor movement growth, consumer campaigns. There's no failure. If you're talking about did the Depression come to an end? No. Did the United States become far more progressive and democratic? Absolutely. So a failure? Absolutely not.
Well, that would only please half the country anyway.
No, it would have pleased the 60% who regularly voted for him. Look. Part of the mythology that I wrote my book to overcome is this idea, that he failed. He absolutely did not fail in the 1930s. The Depression may not have been over as such, but he definitely did not fail. Part of the problem is that liberal historians have over and over again after the war, because they ran from his legacy. They regularly said capitalism was saved because of Roosevelt. I couldn't give a damn if capitalism was saved. Democracy was saved because of Roosevelt, not capitalism.
The same democracy where he said, "To hell with the Constitution, I'm going to change the Supreme Court, the body count, because they won't let me do what I want." And he wanted it both ways. The Social Security Act, which his acolytes brag about, was at least a scam, if not a Ponzi.
Oh, come on. You know, that is the biggest right-wing bullshit. I'm not buying that. Give me a break. That's part of the bullshit that I'm fighting. The fact, that is bullshit. How many of you have Social Security? Have you ever had a check unpaid? No. Then stop calling it a scam. That is bullshit. Oh, come on. Give me a break. I didn't fly across country to put up with the stuff I have to put up with on the internet. Give me another question. Please.
Yeah.
I think, we're talking about the 1940 counterfactual argument.
If you're going to talk, stand up. We can't hear you.
We're talking about the 1940 counterfactual argument. Remember who the Republicans put up against FDR. The most liberal of all of the Republicans. A man who went on to help FDR only a few short months after the election. Wendell Willkie.
Right. And if anybody lied, it was Wendell Willkie. Because Wendell Willkie was more than prepared to have the United States go to war. And he said he would not. Okay? Moreover, for the record, in 1944, Willkie and Roosevelt met. And Willkie and Roosevelt agreed on the creation of a new party, not the Wallace Progressive Party of 1948, but a liberal party. They agreed on it. The difference was Roosevelt would have made Willkie his vice presidential candidate in 1944. Steve may or may not agree with me on that. But Willkie said, no, let's wait till after the election to do all of this. And Willkie dies a very, very young man.
Willkie dropped out of a heart attack in 1944.
Right. Thank you. And I'm more than willing to argue, but I can't, this is just, you know.
Okay, I have two more questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Take another question.
This man standing
I was standing here before I got interrupted.
Yes, thank you.
My questions are two. Why did modern conservatives object to people being not being free of fear or want? The other one is with the photo ID cards. I have 3 of them in my pocket, or from my driver's license, my teacher ID card, and my Sam's card. So what's the big deal? I'd really like to understand your logic.
Let me go both the first question. The first question: why would conservatives oppose
Freedom of fear.
Freedom from want and fear?
No.
Yeah. Okay. The business in the business had, I was expecting, business basically ran the country in the 1920s. Okay? And by the way, I want to make one thing clear. Again, the historical mythology is the 1920s was this great economic growth and everybody prospered. It's just not true. Working people and farmers farmers definitely took a beating in the 1920s. Working people, the only reason they were able to actually advance is that they're working more hours and both men and women were working, which changes the picture. Double the family work and you get more income. But now, so in the 1930s, the question of freedom from want and fear basically meant that there would be it involved economic security. Economic security, okay? That we would do everything we could to abolish poverty, we would guarantee security in old age, we would make sure that young people could get an education, not have to drop out of school. So, okay, the reason they opposed it is this. Don't forget, before all of this, the bosses had you by the proverbial balls, okay? If now you have programs of a public sort which are not immediately subject to the boss's control, that liberates you. It liberates you to think again about, do you want to work this job or do you want to find another? Are you going to demand a higher wage and fear you might be fired? It's a very big difference. It's a real sense of empowerment, okay? Now, regarding the photo IDs, I remember originally hearing about photo IDs years and years ago, and those who opposed it were conservatives. Those who most opposed photo IDs were conservatives, because they said we're moving towards an authoritarian state if we all have to have a federal ID. That's
the voter ID is issued by the state, not by the federal government.
It doesn't matter. Their point was a state, S-T-A-T-E ID. In the general sense, they did not want.
Federal, not state.
They did not want. I understand what you're saying. They did not want any mandated photo IDs. Okay, they didn't want it.
Okay,
Then it comes up for the voting question. The fact is, I'm very glad you have the various IDs you do. There are many people who don't drive, who live in the inner city, who don't drive, who don't have the photo IDs. And in many states around the country, to go in and get a photo ID is limited hours, which are usually during their working hours. I'm not even opposed to photo IDs. I don't oppose photo IDs. What I don't like is that everyone knows there are very few cases of fraudulent voting. And the fact is that it is an effort at voter suppression.
Next question. Go ahead.
Why for quite a long period of time did people abhor the idea of being called, quote, a liberal, unquote? That to me is a very, and to me, if George Washington didn't have a liberal perspective, Catholics and Jews never would have made the advances they had. That was a liberal perspective. And so much of liberalism people don't identify. Why did that happen?
Or how did that happen? Well, by the way, for a start, you made a very interesting observation, and I want to thank you. I tell my students, you know, there's a long thing, you know, well, the American Revolution wasn't really a revolution like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. It wasn't the same kind of violence and turmoil and ups, you know, and we left slavery intact and all that. The most radical thing that came out of the American Revolution was separation of church and state. Okay? And Washington played a role in that, and Jefferson played a role in that. The founders who were deists, basically. Okay? Now, the term liberal, of course, was through the post-war period in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, it got to the point where everyone was considered a liberal practically. Conservatives were marginalized, basically. And what happens is, of course, in the wake of the late 60s, the turmoil of the late 60s, whether it's urban riots or student protests or whatever, okay, conservatives found a lever. And the lever was that liberals were soft on this kind of turmoil, okay? Which, by the way, was true. It was true. Thus begins the attack. And Reagan and others did a very, very good job of turning the tide. Most Americans today don't actually consider themselves one or the other, okay? But generally speaking, they do support, and they always have supported, even when they voted for Ronald Reagan, liberal measures. All the polling shows that even in the 70s and 80s, in the rise of Reagan and the Reagan presidencies, the great majority of Americans wanted all of the liberal policies and initiatives that had begun under Johnson. The problem was they didn't trust Democrats to do it right. And you know what? They were right. Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, and Dukakis were not Roosevelt Democrats. And as a consequence, I mean, Ronald Reagan, who had been one of the great Roosevelt Democrats, was more effective in articulating what America is about than Jimmy Carter ever did, than Walter Mondale ever did, than Dukakis ever did, and frankly better than Clinton ever did. And so I think as a consequence, we've yet to see that kind of spirit. Okay?
Thank you, Harvey.
Right-wing bullshit. I'm not